Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're going to dig into a puzzle that has haunted historians, theologians, and a certain kind of late-night documentary filmmaker for decades. Imagine you're standing in a quiet alleyway in Jerusalem, the air thick with the scent of ancient stone and spices, a million prayers echoing in the walls around you. You're about to go looking for something that, by all accounts, shouldn't even be there. The lost tomb of Jesus Christ. You probably won't survive this intellectual journey with your current beliefs entirely intact, so strap in. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. A little snapshot of our global community. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking, not through some barren desert, but through the labyrinthine streets of Old Jerusalem, a place where history isn't just in books, it's under your feet, it's in the stones you pass. Our story begins not with a shocking discovery, but with a traditional accepted narrative. You've probably seen the pictures, or maybe even been there yourself, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's a vast, sprawling complex that feels less like a single church, and more like a collection of them. A religious shopping mall where different denominations, Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Armenian, Apostolic and others, all have their own little corner. The air is thick with incense and a kind of quiet, reverent chaos. It's here, under a grand dome in a small chapel called the Aedicule, that you're told the tomb of Christ is located. Now, imagine you're standing in line, shuffling forward with pilgrims from every corner of the globe. You can hear a dozen languages being whispered. When you finally get inside the Aedicule, it's tiny, almost claustrophobic. There's a marble slab, worn smooth by millions of hands and lips, and you're told this is the burial bed of Jesus. But here's the thing, this isn't the original tomb. Not even close. The original was destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed again, and rebuilt more times than a sandcastle in a hurricane. It's the archaeological equivalent of a ship that's had every single plank replaced. Is it still the same ship? Is this still the same tomb? That's the kind of question that keeps archaeologists up at night. The history of this site is a mainstream historical fact that's both fascinating and mind-bending. The original tomb was a rock-cut cave, typical of the 1st century. After the crucifixion, a man named Joseph of Arimathea supposedly placed the body there. But then, as the centuries rolled by, things got messy. The Roman Emperor Hadrian, in a move that historians still argue whether it was malicious or just an epic case of urban planning gone wrong, built a temple to the goddess Venus right on top of the site in the 2nd century CE. It was a clear attempt to stamp out the burgeoning Christian faith. Imagine paving over a historic monument with a strip mall dedicated to a rival religion. A little aggressive, right? Then, in the 4th century, with Christianity becoming the state religion, Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, went on a pilgrimage. She was a bit of a historical detective, and she had the means to make things happen. When she arrived, she ordered the Venus temple torn down. What they found underneath, according to the historians of the time, was the tomb. They built the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre over it. But remember that part about the sandcastle? Over the next millennia, the church was burned by Persians, rebuilt, destroyed by a crazy Muslim caliph who, in a fit of rage, hacked the tomb to bits with a pickaxe, and then rebuilt again by crusaders. Each time the site shifted, was modified, or had new layers of construction piled on top. The original rock-cut tomb is now encased in centuries of masonry, marble, and emotional baggage. So when you stand in that small chapel and look at that marble slab, you're not looking at a 1st century tomb, you're looking at a memory of a memory, a story told and retold through brick and mortar. It's this kind of constant historical layering that makes the traditional site so difficult for archaeologists to verify with any certainty. A quirky little tidbit of this history is that the keys to the main entrance of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre have been held by a Muslim family, the Judah family, for centuries. They are the neutral party, the ones trusted to open and close the door every day, preventing the various Christian denominations from fighting over who gets to hold the keys. It's a beautiful and slightly ironic example of religious cooperation born from a need for crowd control. It's also the kind of detail that makes you realise how complex and intertwined the history of this place really is, far beyond the simple stories we learn in Sunday school. So you leave the Holy Sepulchre a little dazed, and you realise that if you're going to find a first century tomb, you can't look for it here. You have to go somewhere else. You have to find a place that hasn't been built on and rebuilt and fought over and decorated and redecorated. You need a place that was simply forgotten. You need a place that was just another ordinary burial site on the outskirts of Jerusalem, a place that no one thought was important enough to pave over or turn into a tourist attraction. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to leave the loud, crowded and somewhat confusing traditional site behind. We're going to search for something smaller, quieter, and maybe, just maybe, something more authentic. You've left the bustle of the old city behind, the sounds of market vendors and ringing bells fading with every step. The journey takes you southeast to a neighbourhood called East Talpiot, a residential area a few miles from the ancient walls. It's a modern suburb, a world away from the dusty, chaotic heart of Jerusalem, and it was here, in 1980, that something happened that would, decades later, shake the foundations of Christian history. The event itself, however, was less a dramatic revelation, and more a bureaucratic inconvenience. A construction crew, a mainstream historical fact in itself, was preparing to build a new apartment complex. As is standard practice in a city built on millennia of history, they had archaeologists on site to check for ancient remains. You can imagine the scene. Bulldozers grumble in the background, a cloud of dust hangs in the air, and a few archaeologists are sifting through the dirt, probably hoping to find something interesting but not expecting a miracle. Their findings were a common, almost mundane occurrence in this region. A rock-cut tomb. It was a perfectly ordinary first-century burial cave, the kind that have been discovered all over Jerusalem. The tomb had a small antechamber and several kokim, or burial niches, carved into the rock walls, designed to hold the bodies of the deceased. Inside, the archaeologists found 10 ossuaries, which are limestone bone boxes. This was also a common practice for Jewish burials in the 1st century CE. After a body decomposed for about a year, the bones were gathered and placed in these boxes. The ossuaries were often inscribed with the name of the deceased, sometimes in Hebrew, sometimes in Aramaic. So the discovery of a tomb with ossuaries wasn't, on its own, earth-shattering. It was a footnote, a small entry in the annals of Israeli archaeology. The archaeologists, led by the respected scholar Amos Kloner, dutifully catalogued their findings. They noted the inscriptions, the condition of the tomb, and then, as far as the world was concerned, that was that. The ossuaries were taken to a museum, the tomb was resealed, and the apartment building went up on schedule. The discovery faded into obscurity. What you need to understand is that the initial doubt surrounding the Talpiot tomb wasn't born from a specific religious or anti-religious agenda. It was born from pure, unadulterated scholarly indifference. The names on the ossuaries, when first translated, didn't set off any alarm bells. They were all common names of the time. There was a Jesus son of Joseph, which was, as we'll discuss later, a name as common as John Smith today. There was a Mary and a Joseph. Nothing about the initial discovery screamed Jesus Christ. Historians still argue whether the lack of immediate fanfare was due to a simple oversight, or a deliberate decision to downplay an uncomfortable finding. The prevailing opinion, though, is that it was simply a case of archaeologists doing their job and finding what they expected to find. A normal, first-century Jewish family tomb. The pieces were all there, but no one saw the picture they formed. This initial reception is a quirky tidbit that's easy to overlook. The tomb was actually discovered in the middle of the night during an emergency salvage operation. The construction crew had inadvertently broken into the tomb, and the archaeologists had to work quickly, under floodlights, to document everything before the site could be secured. Imagine the scene. A makeshift archaeological dig happening under the glare of portable lights, surrounded by bulldozers and the ghostly forms of half-finished apartment buildings. It's a far cry from the Indiana Jones-style adventure films we're used to seeing. It was a quick, dirty and largely thankless job, and it's this hurried, somewhat chaotic origin that meant many of the subtle details were overlooked for years. Think about it like this. If you were handed a box of mismatched puzzle pieces and told to get on with it, you might not notice that a few of those pieces, when put together just right, form a picture of something truly incredible. You'd just see a box of pieces. That's what happened with the Talpiot tomb. For decades, it was just a collection of bone boxes with common names on them. The names were a mainstream historical fact, but their combination wasn't considered significant. They were just names: Yeshua, Yosef, Maria, and so on. There was nothing about them that screamed the Holy Family. So the archaeologists moved on, and the ossuaries were stored away, their secrets locked inside them. The scepticism and doubt that would later become a firestorm were, at this point, a quiet smoulder. It was a simple question of probability and evidence. The academic community looked at the names, looked at the lack of any additional identifying information, like titles or place of origin, and said, "This is a first-century family, nothing more, nothing less." There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic press conferences, just a matter-of-fact report. This is a crucial detail to remember as we move forward. The initial scholarly view was not one of rejection of a revolutionary idea, but of simple, mundane acceptance of a very common one. The tomb was just another tomb. The ossuaries were just more ossuaries. The names were just more names. The lack of any immediate excitement or debate is, in a way, the most honest and telling part of this entire story. It tells you that the burden of proof, from the very beginning, was going to be incredibly high. It also makes you wonder what other forgotten tombs, what other seemingly unremarkable discoveries are out there waiting to be re-examined. Perhaps one day we will learn that some other seemingly mundane archaeological report holds the key to another great mystery. But for now, our focus is on this one small, almost forgotten tomb in a suburb of Jerusalem, and the sleeping puzzle pieces it held for so long. So there you are, with the Talpiot tomb fading into suburban anonymity. Just another archaeological footnote. The ossuaries, those bone boxes with their common names, are stored away, gathering museum dust. For 2 decades they are largely forgotten. But history, like a good horror movie villain, has a funny way of not staying buried. The next chapter in our story isn't about an archaeologist with a pickaxe, but about an art collector with a peculiar eye and a global police investigation. The year is 2002, and a man named Oded Golan, a prominent Israeli antiquities dealer and collector, is at the centre of a forgery trial. Police have raided his home and found a treasure trove of ancient artefacts, some legitimate, some not so much. Among his collection is a small limestone box, an ossuary, but this one is different. It's meticulously carved and bears a tantalising Aramaic inscription. The inscription reads, Yaakov bar Yosef Akwidi Yeshua. In English that translates to, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now stop for a second and let that sink in. A bone box claiming to hold the remains of the brother of Jesus Christ. If this was real, it would be the first tangible archaeological link to the New Testament's central figures outside of the burial shroud of Turin, which is a whole other kettle of fish we'll get to later. The ossuary itself was beautiful, with a rosette carving on the side, a common motif, but the inscription was what made it instantly world famous. It was unveiled by a French scholar, André Lemaire, who believed it to be authentic. The media went wild. It was a global sensation. This was exactly the kind of evidence the world had been waiting for. But there was a problem, a very big problem. The ossuary had come from a private collection. Its provenance, or chain of ownership, couldn't be definitively traced back to its discovery. It had been floating around the antiquities market for years. The antiquities trade is, to put it gently, a murky business. Forgeries are common, and the line between an honest antique dealer and a talented con artist can be blurry. The Israel Antiquities Authority, IAA, was immediately suspicious. A special committee of experts was assembled, and their conclusion was devastating. The inscription was a fake. Specifically, they believed the last part of the inscription, Akwidi Yeshua, brother of Jesus, was added much later by a modern hand to increase the ossuary's value. The patina, the thin layer of oxidation that forms on ancient stone, on this section of the text was allegedly different from the rest. A mainstream historical fact of this era is that the IA's investigation concluded it was a modern forgery, a conclusion that led to Oded Golan's high-profile trial. Historians still argue whether the entire inscription was forged or just the last most significant part. The debate became a proxy war for the authenticity of any potential biblical artifacts. Was it possible for a forger to be so good? The trial dragged on for years. Eventually, Golan was acquitted on the charge of forging the ossuary, but convicted of other charges related to the illegal trade of antiquities. The judge ruled that the IA had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the inscription was a forgery, and that the possibility it was real couldn't be ruled out. This didn't mean the ossuary was definitively real, though. It just meant its forgery couldn't be definitively proven. It was a legal stalemate that left the academic world more polarised than ever. The James Ossory's story is a quirky or fringe tidbit because it directly connects to our main topic in an unexpected way. Oded Golan was accused of forging the James Ossory, but he was also connected to the Talpiot tomb. He claimed he had visited the tomb in 1980 before it was sealed, and had seen a number of ossuaries there, including one he believed was the James Ossuary. This was a convenient claim, but it was also a flimsy one. The story of the James Ossuary and the ensuing trial cast a long shadow of doubt over any new claims of biblical discoveries. It created a climate of extreme skepticism. When another discovery, the Talpiot tomb, was later brought back into the spotlight, it was seen through the lens of this scandal. People immediately wondered if it was another elaborate hoax, another attempt to cash in on a biblical narrative. The James Ossuary didn't just stand on its own, it became part of a larger conversation about forgery, faith, and the very high stakes of biblical archaeology. So, for a brief, glorious moment, the world thought it had found the first-century bone box of Jesus' brother, and then, just as quickly, the possibility was snatched away, replaced by the grim reality of a forgery trial. The James Ossuary became a cautionary tale, a reminder that in this field, sensationalism is often a red flag. It reminded everyone that the desire for a physical link to Jesus is so strong that it can lead people to believe in, or even create, things that aren't real. It made the entire archaeological community wary. And it's into this sceptical atmosphere that our forgotten Talpiot tomb, with its seemingly mundane names, is about to be thrust back into the limelight. The James Ossuary affair also highlights the critical difference between legal and archaeological standards of proof. A court of law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, a very high bar. Archaeology, however, relies on peer review, consensus, and the weight of evidence. The scholarly consensus, even after the acquittal, largely remained that the ossuary's inscription was highly suspicious. The legal acquittal of Golan did not mean that the artefact itself was accepted as authentic by the academic community, and so, a priceless potential relic remained in a state of purgatory, neither proven fake nor proven real, a powerful symbol of the challenges inherent in biblical archaeology. It's a reminder that a verdict in a courtroom doesn't always align with the verdict of history. The air is still humming with the lingering static of the James Ossuary scandal. The public, the media, and the academic world are all a bit gun-shy. Everyone is looking for the next big biblical discovery, but everyone is also ready to call forgery at the slightest provocation. It's into this tense and sceptical atmosphere that the forgotten Talpiot tomb is resurrected, not by an archaeologist in a dusty trench, but by a filmmaker in a sterile editing bay. The year is 2007. The filmmakers Simcha Jacobovici and James Cameron, yes, that James Cameron of Titanic and Avatar fame, are preparing to release a documentary. It's called The Lost Tomb of Jesus, and it's about to turn a long-forgotten archaeological footnote into a global headline. This is the moment when the mundane becomes sensational, when a collection of common names becomes a cryptographic puzzle, and when a quiet burial cave becomes the most debated piece of rock in the world. The documentary's premise is simple but provocative. What if the combination of names on those Talpiot ossuaries wasn't a coincidence? What if it was a puzzle, one that archaeologists in 1980 just didn't have the key to? The film re-examined the tomb and its contents, bringing in statisticians and epigraphers to re-evaluate the inscriptions. It connected the dots in a way no one had before, and it did so with a dramatic flourish that only a major film production could provide. The filmmaker's central argument, a mainstream historical fact of the documentary itself, was that the names on the ossuaries, when taken together, are incredibly rare as a family group. The inscriptions they focused on were Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph, Maria, Mary, Yose, Joseph, a nickname for Jesus' brother, Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah, son of Jesus, Mariamene Emara, Mary Magdalene with a title, Mattia, Matthew. The documentary argued that while each name individually was common, the specific combination of a Jesus, his father Joseph, a Mary, a brother Yose, and another Mary with a specific title, was statistically improbable to be just a random family. They enlisted a statistician who, in the film, calculated the odds of such a family existing as something astronomically low, something like 1 in 600 million. This number and the dramatic flair with which it was presented became the central pillar of the film's argument and the fuel for the subsequent media firestorm. The film's release was a masterclass in media manipulation. It came with a book, a dedicated website, and a high-profile press conference in New York City. James Cameron's name attached to the project gave it an instant air of legitimacy and a massive platform that no academic paper could ever hope to achieve. The timing was perfect, capitalising on the public's fascination with biblical mysteries and the lingering questions left by the James Ossery trial. It didn't just present a hypothesis, it presented a cinematic, emotionally resonant narrative. This is where a quirky or fringe tidbit comes into play: the Mariamene Mara inscription. The documentary argued that Mariamene was a Hellenized form of Mary, and that Mara, an Aramaic word for master, or lord, meant Mary the Master. They proposed that this was a reference to Mary Magdalene, elevating her status and in a truly provocative twist, suggesting she was Jesus' wife. This idea, linking Jesus and Mary Magdalene, was a cultural touchstone already, thanks in part to the popularity of Dan Brown's novel The Da Vinci Code, which had been a global phenomenon a few years earlier. The documentary tapped directly into this existing cultural conversation, giving the film an added layer of intrigue and scandal. It was less about a dusty tomb and more about a secret love affair. Of course, the documentary and its claims were immediately and vehemently challenged. Scholars and archaeologists, many of whom had seen the tomb's initial discovery, were incensed. They accused the filmmakers of sensationalism, misinterpretation, and a blatant disregard for established archaeological practice. The statistical analysis was torn apart, with critics pointing out that the premise was flawed. The name Yosef, for example, was argued to be a contraction of Joseph, not a separate name for a brother, and the name Mariamene Mara was retranslated by some scholars to be Mariamene of the Master, a name for a Christian follower, not a spouse. The debate over this single inscription is something historians still argue whether the inscription is a reference to a wife, a disciple, or something else entirely. The film's conclusion was not a foregone conclusion for the scholarly community. The backlash was swift and fierce. A televised debate was held at the time of the film's release, where top scholars publicly dismantled the documentary's claims. They argued that the filmmakers had selectively presented evidence and ignored crucial context. For example, they pointed out that the documentary failed to mention that the name Jesus, son of Joseph, was actually found on 2 ossuaries in 2 different tombs in the same area. This detail, critics said, undermined the statistical uniqueness of the Talpiot tomb. The documentary, for all its flashy graphics and dramatic music, was accused of being a house of cards, built on circumstantial evidence and wishful thinking. But the damage was done. The forgotten Talpiot tomb was now a household name. The debate was no longer confined to academic journals. It was on CNN, in the New York Times, and in every online forum dedicated to ancient history. The documentary had succeeded in one thing, if nothing else. It had forced the world to look at those ossuaries again. It had brought the tomb out of obscurity and into a global spotlight, setting the stage for decades of arguments and re-examinations. The film, regardless of its ultimate scholarly merit, had permanently changed the conversation. You'll never look at a news report about a biblical discovery the same way again, knowing how easily a quiet historical fact can be turned into a media circus. So you're standing in the middle of a media storm. The documentary has aired, and everyone has an opinion. The quiet hum of scholarly debate has been replaced by the roar of cable news panels and heated online forums. But let's rewind and take a closer, calmer look at the core of the controversy. Those inscriptions on the ossuaries, you've heard the names: Jesus, Joseph, Mary. Now it's time to see them for what they are, without the dramatic music and the slick camera work. The Talpiot tomb contained 10 ossuaries, but only 6 of them had inscriptions that the documentary focused on. The inscriptions themselves are a mainstream historical fact, documented by archaeologists in 1980. They were written in Aramaic and Greek, the languages of the time. Let's break them down one by one, because this is where the puzzle gets truly interesting and where a lot of the debate lives. First up, the most explosive name, Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph. On its own, this is a very, very common name for the first century. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 5 men were named Jesus, Yeshua, and Joseph, was also incredibly popular. So finding an ossuary with this name is about as surprising as finding a Starbucks in Seattle. But the documentary argued it was the combination with the other names that was the smoking gun. Next, we have Yos. This name has been a major point of contention. The documentary's proponents argue this is a nickname for Jesus' brother James, who is also known as Yos in the New Testament. The skeptics, however, point out that Yos is a very common nickname for Joseph. The inscription itself doesn't specify if this Yos is a brother of Jesus, or if he's related to the Jesus son of Joseph on the other ossuary at all. This is a crucial detail. The documentary presented it as a given, a solid link. The reality is far more ambiguous, a classic case of selective interpretation. Historians still argue whether Yos is a nickname for Joseph, or a distinct name for a separate person. Then there are the two Marys. One ossuary is simply inscribed Maria, a Latinized form of Mary. Again, Mary, Miriam, was the most popular female name in 1st century Judea. Finding a Mary in a tomb from this period is like finding a grain of sand on a beach. It's expected. The other Mary is the one that really gets people talking, Mariamene e Mara. We touched on this last time. The documentary connected her to Mary Magdalene, the disciple and companion of Jesus. The addition of e Mara, or the Master, was presented as a reference to her elevated status, possibly as his wife. But here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. This reading is far from universally accepted. Scholars have proposed other translations like Mariamene and the Master, or Mariamene, a member of the Mara family, or even that Amara is a later addition or a misreading. The ambiguity of a few Greek letters has launched 1,000 academic papers. We also have Mattia, which is Matthew. The documentary speculates this could be the Apostle Matthew, a fellow disciple, further bolstering the family and friends theory. But there's nothing on the ossuary itself to link this Mattia to the Apostle, and Matthew, while not as common as Mary or Joseph, was still a known name. Finally, there's Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah, son of Jesus. This is the big one, the inscription that suggests a direct familial link to Jesus. If the Jesus is indeed Jesus of Nazareth, then this would mean he had a son. This inscription, more than any other, is what gives the documentary its central, most controversial claim. But again, a crucial piece of the puzzle is missing. There is nothing to prove this Yeshua is the same Yeshua from the other ossuary. It's an inference, not an established fact. The documentary's argument rested on a statistical calculation. They asked what are the odds of finding all these names in a single tomb, and their answer was basically 0. But the statistical model was immediately attacked for its flawed assumptions. For example, it assumed all the ossuaries belonged to the same family and that they were all from the same time. It also assumed that the names were all correctly identified and translated. Critics argued that if you relax those assumptions, and you take into account the high frequency of these names, the statistical improbability disappears. It becomes less of a lottery-winning combination and more of a predictable result. For example, think about how many people you know named John. Now think of how many people you know named John who have a brother named James. Now imagine a city of 100,000 people. The chances of finding a family with a John, a James, a Mary, and a Joseph are pretty high. They aren't a 1 in a million occurrence. The statistical argument was powerful for a TV show, but it didn't hold up to rigorous academic scrutiny. This whole process of taking a set of facts and interpreting them through a particular lens is what makes this topic so captivating and so frustrating. The names on the ossuaries are real. They are a documented archaeological find. But what they mean is a matter of interpretation, and that interpretation is where the battle lines are drawn. The documentary drew a straight line from the names to the New Testament. The skeptics drew a line from the names to a common 1st century family. The truth, as is often the case with history, is probably somewhere in the murky middle, forever lost to the passing of time and the limitations of our evidence. You've been through the media storm, the statistical arguments, and the careful deconstruction of the names themselves. Now let's hone in on the one inscription that truly sets this whole fire ablaze, the one that makes people lean forward and whisper, Maria Mene e Mara. We've touched on it, but it deserves its own deep dive. It's not just a name, it's a portal into a parallel universe of Gnostic Gospels, forgotten disciples, and a very different view of the role of women in early Christianity. The ossuary in question is inscribed with Greek letters. This is already a noteworthy detail. Many of the other ossuaries had Aramaic inscriptions, the language of the common people. Greek was the language of Hellenized Jews, of the educated, and of the wider Roman Empire. This suggests that the person buried here, or at least the person who carved the inscription, was part of a more cosmopolitan, culturally diverse community. The inscription itself, Mariamene Mara, has been a battleground for scholars. The documentary's proponents, a mainstream historical fact of the film's premise, argued that Mariamene was a Hellenized form of Mary, and that Mara meant master, or lord, a respectful and honorific title. The argument was that this was Mary Magdalene, and the title Mara was a hint at her elevated status, perhaps even a coded reference to her being Jesus' wife. This theory isn't just a random guess. It connects to a quirky or fringe tidbit from a different part of the historical record. In the early Christian texts known as the Gnostic Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Philip, Mary Magdalene is often referred to as a special, beloved disciple. The Gospel of Philip even contains a tantalizing fragment of a passage that reads, "And the companion of the Saviour is Mary Magdalene. But Christ loved her more than all the disciples, and used to kiss her often on her mouth. The rest of the disciples were offended by it and expressed disapproval." Now, of course, the text is fragmented and open to interpretation. Some scholars say kiss could be a spiritual greeting, not a romantic one, and the word for companion is a different Greek word that doesn't explicitly mean wife. But the Gnostic tradition, which was ultimately deemed heretical by the mainstream church, clearly shows a different, more intimate relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The documentary used this as powerful circumstantial evidence to argue that the Mariamene Mara inscription was a tangible, archaeological link to this alternative historical narrative. But, as with everything in this story, there's a whole other side. The scholarly consensus outside of the documentary's circle is far more sceptical. They argue that Mariamene Mara has other more mundane translations. For example, some suggest that E is a simple conjunction, meaning and. So the inscription could read, Mariamene and Mara. This would mean it was an ossuary for two different people, a mother and child perhaps, or two sisters. Another theory, a strong one at that, is that Mara is a simple nickname, a term of affection, or even part of a name, and not a grandiose title. A third theory suggests that Mara is a common first name, and the inscription refers to two women named Mariamene and Mara. The fact is, the inscription is ambiguous. It's not a billboard that says, "Here lies Mary Magdalene, wife of Jesus." It's a few letters carved into a rock that could mean a dozen different things. This open, scholarly debate over the translation of a few letters highlights the inherent difficulty of this work. It's a linguistic puzzle with missing pieces. The interpretation of Mara as master is possible, but it's not the only or even the most likely interpretation. Historians still argue whether the inscription Mariamene Mara refers to a single individual, a pair of individuals, or is simply a nickname. The proponents of the documentary leaned into the most sensational interpretation, while the academic community, by and large, has pulled back, pointing to the lack of corroborating evidence. The larger historical context is also important here. The Roman world was a patriarchal one. It was incredibly rare for a woman to be given an honorific title like Mara, in a public or semi-public context like an ossuary inscription. While it's not impossible, it certainly raises a red flag for many scholars. We have a fringe tradition in the Gnostic Gospels that provides some parallel historical context, but we also have a host of other, more mundane and historically probable interpretations. The Mariamene Mara ossuary is a perfect microcosm of the entire Talpiot tomb debate. It's not a question of fact versus fiction. The inscription is a fact. The question is of interpretation, and what kind of story you're trying to tell with that interpretation. The documentary told a story of a hidden family and a suppressed truth. The skeptics tell a story of a common family and a common tomb, with a few names that just happen to line up with our most famous historical figures. Both are telling stories. The difference is which story has the most evidence to back it up, and which story we, as listeners, are most willing to believe. And as you've probably guessed by now, the answer to that isn't always black and white. The debate over the names is just one piece of the puzzle. Now you're in a sterile lab wearing a white coat and gloves, and you're looking at something far smaller and more intimate than an inscription, a sample of DNA. The documentary wasn't just about names, it was also about science. The filmmakers had gained permission to perform mitochondrial DNA analysis on the remains from two of the ossuaries. This part of the story takes us away from the dusty fields of archaeology and into the high-tech world of genetics, a place where a few tiny fragments of genetic code can tell a story thousands of years old. Mitochondrial DNA is a quirky or fringe tidbit in this field. It's passed down almost exclusively through the maternal line, from mother to child. This makes it an incredibly powerful tool for tracing family connections, especially along the female side. If two people share the same mtDNA, it means they share a common maternal ancestor, at least within a certain number of generations. It's the ultimate family heirloom, passed down through the generations from one mother to the next. The documentary filmmakers focused on two specific ossuaries for their DNA testing. The one inscribed with Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph, and the one inscribed with Mariam and Imara, Mary Magdalene. The assumption was, if their hypothesis was correct and these two individuals were husband and wife, their mtDNA would be different. But if they were, say, siblings, their mDNA would be the same. The results of the tests, a mainstream historical fact of the documentary, were presented as a scientific smoking gun. The mDNA from the Jesus ossuary and the mDNA from the Mary Magdalene ossuary were in fact different. This result, the film argued, supported their theory. It meant the two individuals were not maternally related. They were not siblings or cousins from the same maternal line. And in a tomb that the documentary claimed was for a single family, this was presented as powerful evidence that the two were a married couple. The logic was, they're buried together, they're not related on the mother's side, therefore they must be spouses. It was a neat, tidy conclusion that seemed to be backed by hard science. But as you've probably come to expect by now, this neat conclusion was immediately challenged by the scientific and archaeological communities. Historians still argue whether the DNA evidence proves anything at all. The skeptics raised a number of crucial points. First, the samples were tiny and degraded. They were extracted from a tomb that had been opened and closed, and from ossuaries that had been handled by multiple people over the years. The potential for contamination was high. The results, while intriguing, were far from conclusive. It was a classic garbage in, garbage out problem. If the samples were contaminated, the results were meaningless. Second, the statistical interpretation was flawed. The fact that the two individuals had different mtDNA sequences doesn't prove they were married. It simply proves they were not maternally related. This is what you would expect for a married couple, but it's also what you would expect for a family that includes a daughter-in-law, a son-in-law, or even just a friend who was buried in the family tomb. In the 1st century, it wasn't unheard of for a family tomb to be used for non-blood relatives. So the DNA evidence, while not contradicting the hypothesis, didn't actually prove it either. It was presented as a definitive answer, but in reality it was just another ambiguous piece of the puzzle. It ruled out one possibility, maternal siblings, but left a dozen others, spouses, in-laws, friends, wide open. A third major critique was that the DNA testing was never peer-reviewed in a mainstream scientific journal before the documentary's release. The filmmakers went straight to the public with their conclusions, bypassing the rigorous process of scientific scrutiny. This is a big no-no in the academic world. The results were presented as a fait accompli, a done deal, before the scientific community had a chance to weigh in. This further alienated many scholars and scientists who felt the documentary was more interested in spectacle than in science. The whole process was seen as a way to get a sensational story out, rather than to get to the truth. So while the documentary's claim about the DNA sounds impressive on the surface, a deeper look reveals a lot of cracks. The DNA was too degraded to be conclusive. The statistical interpretation was overly simplistic, and the scientific process was flawed. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from our last story? The DNA evidence here is a bit like that. It sounds exotic and scientific, but on closer inspection, it might just be a bit of a mess. The DNA evidence is a powerful example of how scientific data can be used to tell a specific story, and how that story can be challenged by looking at the data from a different perspective. The filmmakers used it to argue for a hidden secret family. The skeptics used it to argue that the results were inconclusive and the conclusions were unwarranted. Ultimately, the DNA evidence, for all its high-tech appeal, did not settle the debate. It simply added another layer of complexity to a story that was already impossibly complicated. And so, the mystery remains, buried not in a tomb, but in the annals of a flawed and highly politicised documentary. Let's leave the Talpiot tomb behind for a moment, just to get a little perspective. The world of biblical archaeology is not a single isolated field It's a sprawling landscape of digs, theories and competing claims, and you're about to go to another one of them, a place where a different set of archaeologists found a very different set of remains that, for a time, presented another alternative to the tomb of Christ. We're heading to the Akeldama tombs. Akeldama is a mainstream historical fact mentioned in the New Testament. The name means field of blood in Aramaic. It's where, according to the Gospel of Matthew, Judas Iscariot bought a potter's field with the 30 pieces of silver he received for betraying Jesus, and where he later hanged himself. The field was then used as a burial place for foreigners, a little historical tidbit that adds to the grim atmosphere of the place. So, the area has a biblical connection from the get-go, but not a particularly pleasant one. In the 1980s and 1990s, a large complex of burial caves was discovered at Akeldama. Like the Talpiot tomb, these were 1st century rock-cut tombs. They contained a significant number of ossuaries, more than 100 of them, which were subsequently studied by the archaeologist Boaz Zissou. What made these tombs interesting, and a serious contender for a new line of debate, was what they contained. Along with the bones of 1st century Jews, archaeologists found evidence of a significant number of Hellenistic and Roman artifacts. This suggested that these tombs were used by a more diverse group of people than the average Jewish burial cave. Some of the ossuaries at Akeldama had inscriptions that were particularly noteworthy. One ossuary was found with the inscription Yehoseph bar Caiapha, or Joseph, son of Caiaphas. This is a big deal. Caiaphas was the Jewish high priest who, according to the Gospels, presided over the Sanhedrin trial of Jesus. This discovery was huge. It was the first time an archaeological artifact had been found with the name of a major New Testament figure on it. The ossuary, now a confirmed mainstream historical fact, is on display at the Israel Museum, a tangible link to the world of Jesus. But the real debate, the one that makes Akeldama an alternative to Talpiot, is a quirkier or fringe tidbit. In the Akeldama complex, a specific group of ossuaries was found that archaeologists designated as the patrician family ossuaries. They were more elaborately decorated than the others, suggesting they belonged to a wealthy or high-status family. The argument was that this was a family tomb that would have been used by someone as prominent as Joseph of Arimathea, the man who, according to the Gospels, owned the tomb where Jesus was buried. This opened up the possibility that the Akeldama tombs, not the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or the Talpiot tomb, were a more likely location for the burial of a prominent figure like Jesus. The argument went something like this. Joseph of Arimathea was a rich and respected member of the Sanhedrin. He would have had a burial cave commensurate with his status. The Akeldama tombs, with their elaborate and wealthy burials, fit this profile far better than the modest and simple Talpiot tomb. Furthermore, some scholars argue that the Talpiot tomb, located in a poorer residential area, would be an unlikely burial place for a prominent member of the Sanhedrin. The Akeldama complex, with its more impressive burials, was a more plausible candidate. Historians still argue whether the presence of a patrician family tomb at Akeldama makes it a more likely location for the burial of Christ. The debate is a fascinating one because it's not based on sensational names or statistical improbabilities, but on social and economic probabilities. Which tomb makes more sense for a rich man to own? A simple family cave or a more elaborate one? This is a much more grounded archaeological debate than the one surrounding the Talpiot tomb. The Akeldama tombs also have a few other noteworthy details that make them a compelling alternative. For one, they were found undisturbed, or at least mostly undisturbed. This is a huge advantage over the Holy Sepulchre, which has been torn down and rebuilt countless times, and even over the Talpiot tomb, which was breached by a construction crew. The Akeldama finds, especially the Caiaphas ossuary, provided a solid, undisputed connection to the historical world of the Gospels. So while the Talpiot tomb was grabbing all the headlines with its sensational names and statistical arguments, the Akeldama tombs were quietly offering a different, and perhaps more plausible, alternative. They offered an argument not based on a highly debated documentary, but on a tangible, undisputed piece of evidence, the Caiaphas ossuary, and a logical, if unproven, argument about the social status of Joseph of Arimathea. It reminds us that for every single, flashy theory that gets all the media attention, there are a dozen other more nuanced and historically grounded theories waiting in the wings. It's a good reminder that the search for the historical Jesus isn't just a quest for a single name, but for a whole world of evidence, context, and nuance. The Akeldama tombs, while not providing a Jesus ossuary, provided something just as valuable, a concrete link to the social and political world he lived in. The documentary's dramatic claims and the counter-arguments from the Akeldama tombs have set the stage. But now, you need to step back and ask the most fundamental question of all. How do we know how old these ossuaries are? The whole Talpiot theory hinges on the idea that these artefacts are genuinely from the 1st century CE. If they're not, the entire house of cards collapses. This section is all about the science of dating, the unsung hero of archaeology, and the controversies that can arise even from what seems like a simple, objective process. The mainstream historical fact is that archaeologists primarily use two methods to date artefacts from this period: stratigraphy and paleography. Stratigraphy is the study of layers of earth and rock. It's the most basic principle of archaeology. Things found in deeper layers are generally older than things found in shallower layers. The Talpiot tomb, a rock-cut cave, was found in a specific layer of earth. The ossuaries inside were dated based on their location within the sealed tomb, which was a known practice in the 1st century CE. The tomb's design itself, with its kokim, burial niches, is characteristic of that period, specifically from around 20 BCE to 70 CE. This provides a solid, if not precise, time frame. Paleography, a quirkier or fringe tidbit, is the study of ancient handwriting. The style of the letters and the way the inscriptions were carved can be compared to other dated inscriptions from the same period. For example, the lettering on the Yeshua bar Yosef ossuary is a distinct style that was common in the 1st century. Experts in the field, called epigraphers, can analyse the slant of the letters, the form of the characters, and the overall style to give a very good estimate of when the inscription was made. This method is incredibly precise, but it requires a lot of expertise and a lot of comparative material. The paleographic evidence for the Talpiot ossuaries, for the most part, points to a 1st century date, which lends credibility to their authenticity. Now, let's talk about the controversy. The documentary's claims led to a lot of new scrutiny, and some of it was not favourable. For example, some critics suggested that the ossuaries were not all from the same time. The tomb itself may have been used for an extended period, and the ossuaries may have been added over time. While the general style of the ossuaries is consistent with the 1st century, slight variations in style and inscription could suggest that they are not all from the same generation. This would undermine the statistical argument that they all belong to a single tight-knit family. Another major controversy revolves around the use of a more advanced dating technique, carbon-14 dating. The documentary's proponents pushed for this, as it can give a more precise date than stratigraphy or paleography. Carbon-14 dating, as you probably know, measures the amount of carbon-14 remaining in an organic sample to determine its age. The remains inside the ossuaries, and even the ossuaries themselves, which are made of limestone, could theoretically be dated this way. But here's the problem. Archaeologists, by and large, are incredibly hesitant to do this. Why? Because it's an invasive process that can destroy a priceless artefact. To get a carbon-14 date, you have to take a sample, which means you have to scrape off or chip away a piece of the ossuary. This is a very high price to pay for a date that might not even be conclusive, especially if the sample is contaminated. This is a classic example of an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the risk of damaging an ancient artefact is worth the potential reward of a more precise date. The documentary's proponents argue that the potential for a world-changing discovery justifies the risk. The traditionalists argue that we have enough circumstantial evidence to date the ossuaries to the 1st century, and that destroying a piece of our limited historical record for a potentially inconclusive test is an act of intellectual hubris. This debate isn't just about science, it's about ethics, preservation, and the very nature of archaeological inquiry. The dating of the Talpiot ossuaries is a case study in how a set of facts can be interpreted in different ways. The mainstream dating methods, stratigraphy and paleography, point to a 1st century date. This is a widely accepted conclusion. But the controversy comes from the interpretation of that date. Is the 1st century date a solid foundation for the documentary's claims? Or is it simply a neutral fact that has no bearing on the identity of the people inside? The skeptics would argue the latter. A 1st century date means the ossuaries are from the right period, but it doesn't mean they belong to the right people. It just means they're from the right time. It's a necessary piece of the puzzle, but not a sufficient one. It's the difference between a timestamp and a name tag. The timestamp is correct, but the name tag might be a complete coincidence. And as with so much of this story, The difference between those two interpretations is everything. The debate over the dating and the names has brought us to this point. The inscription Yeshua bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph. The documentary's proponents treat it as a smoking gun. The skeptics treat it as a red herring. It's the single most important inscription, but it's also the most common. And understanding why this is both the heart of the argument and its greatest weakness is crucial to grasping this entire mystery. First, let's establish a mainstream historical fact. Jesus, Yeshua, was an incredibly common name in first century Judea. We know this from historical records, from other ossuaries found in Jerusalem, and from the New Testament itself, which mentions other men named Jesus. Flavius Josephus, the first century historian, mentions over a dozen people with this name. It was so popular, in fact, that it was the Greek version of Joshua, a revered biblical figure. Think of it this way. If you went to a cemetery in America today and found a tombstone that read John Smith, you wouldn't assume it was the famous explorer, would you? You'd assume it was just a very common name. That's the exact same logic the skeptics apply to the Jesus son of Joseph ossuary. The name Joseph, Yosef, was also one of the most popular male names of the period. The combination of the two, Jesus son of Joseph, would have been far from unique. A quirky or fringe tidbit of this is that archaeologists have found at least two other ossuaries in Jerusalem with the exact same inscription. One was found in the Kidron Valley, and another in a different part of the Talpiot area. This fact alone, the existence of multiple Jesus son of Joseph ossuaries, is enough to completely undermine the documentary's statistical argument. The rarity of the name combination is the central pillar of the documentary, and it's a pillar that crumbles under the weight of a few other, less sensational archaeological finds. So if the name is so common, why is it such a big deal? Because it's a perfect storm of hope, faith, and wishful thinking. The documentary's argument, stripped of all its bells and whistles, is essentially a probabilistic one. It says the name combination is rare, therefore it's him. But as we've seen, the premise of that argument is flawed. The name combination is not rare, it's common. So the argument shifts. Now the argument becomes the name combination plus the names of a Mother Mary, a possible brother Yosef, a possible son Judah, and a possible wife Mary Magdalene, all in the same tomb, is what makes it unique. This is where an open, scholarly debate phrase comes into play. Historians still argue whether the combined names in the Talpiot tomb represent a statistical anomaly or a simple coincidence. Proponents of the theory argue that even if each name is common, the combination of all of them in a single family tomb is just too improbable to ignore. They will point to the New Testament and say, here is a list of his family members and here are the names on the ossuaries. They match. The skeptics, however, will say that the names don't actually match perfectly, and that the matches are based on a selective and generous interpretation of the inscriptions. They will point out, for example, that the name Yosef isn't a guaranteed match for Jesus' brother. They will point out that Mariamene Mara isn't a guaranteed match for Mary Magdalene, and they will point out that Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah son of Jesus, is the most tenuous link of all, a claim that rests on the assumption that the Jesus is the Jesus, which is exactly what needs to be proven. The name Jesus is a powerful symbol. It's not just a name, it's an idea. The documentary's central claim tapped directly into that power. It said, "We have found the physical remains of this idea, but the reality, as is so often the case in this field, is far more mundane. The name is just a name. The burden of proof is on the person who claims it's more than that. And so far that burden has not been met. The Jesus inscription is the perfect example of the challenges of biblical archaeology. We have a piece of evidence that is undeniably from the right time and place. It has a name on it that we are all familiar with. It has the potential to be a world-shattering discovery. But it's also a perfect example of a red herring. It's a name that is so common, so widespread, that it tells us almost nothing on its own. The power of the name is in the eye of the beholder. For believers, it's a sign. For archaeologists, it's a data point. The documentary's genius was in presenting it as a sign, and the subsequent backlash's genius was in reducing it back to a data point. And in this case, the data point on its own is just not enough. The Talpiot tomb debate has focused on a series of provocative but unproven claims. The time has come to leave the suburbs of Jerusalem and go back to where it all began, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You're standing once more in that dimly lit, incense-filled space. But this time you're not just a pilgrim, you're an investigator looking for a different kind of evidence. For centuries the church has been dismissed by many as a place of religious sentimentality, not historical fact. Its layers of reconstruction, the shifting claims, and the sheer chaos of competing denominations made it easy to write off. But recent archaeological work, a mainstream historical fact that is often overlooked, is forcing a reassessment. For the longest time, the original tomb was believed to be completely gone, destroyed beyond recognition. It was a convenient excuse for both religious scholars who didn't need physical proof and secular scholars who didn't want to deal with the complexities of the site. But in 2016, a team of archaeologists and conservationists undertook a massive project to restore the aedicule, the small chapel built over the tomb. For the first time in centuries they were able to remove the marble slab that covered the burial bed, and what they found underneath was extraordinary. They found the original rock-cut limestone burial bed. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the original rock-cut limestone was not completely destroyed. While a significant portion of the cave had been demolished by the Muslim Caliph al-Hakim in the 11th century, a substantial part of the original rock-cut tomb was still there, encased in the marble and masonry of 1,000 years of reconstruction. The team even found a fragment of a rock with a cross carved into it, possibly from the time of the Crusaders, a silent testament to the long history of veneration. The original rock-cut bench, which would have held the body of the deceased, was still intact. This was not a memory of a memory, it was the actual tangible rock. The discovery was a massive blow to the Talpiot tomb theory. The Talpiot tomb's central claim was that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre couldn't possibly contain the actual tomb of Christ, because it was a destroyed and rebuilt monument. The 2016 restoration proved that, while heavily modified, the core of the original tomb still exists. This doesn't, of course, prove that Jesus was buried there. That's a matter of faith and a separate historical debate. But it does prove that the traditional site has a very real, very physical connection to a first-century burial cave. It forces us to reevaluate the entire premise that a different tomb must be found because the original one is gone. This brings us to an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the discovery of the original rock-cut tomb makes the Holy Sepulchre a more historically plausible site for Christ's burial. The discovery is a powerful piece of evidence, a tangible link to the first century. But it also raises new questions. We know a tomb was there. We know it was a first-century tomb. But was it the tomb? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located within the ancient city walls, a detail that has been used to argue against it being the burial place of Christ, as Jewish law required burials to be outside the city walls. However, another crucial fact emerged from the restoration. The church is on a hill that was outside the city walls at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, before the walls were expanded by King Herod Agrippa I in 41 to 44 CE. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a mainstream historical fact, is located on a site that was, at the time of Jesus' death, a quarry outside the city walls. This makes the location perfectly plausible for a first-century Jewish burial. So now the traditional site has a lot going for it. It has the backing of centuries of tradition. It has a physical rock-cut tomb from the right period. And its location, which was once a point of contention, has now been clarified. It's no longer just a church. It's an archaeological site with a new layer of evidence. The documentary's main argument against the Holy Sepulchre, that it was a religious fantasy built on a long-vanished site, has been largely debunked. This doesn't mean the Talpiot tomb theory is completely dead, but it does mean that its main argument has been significantly weakened. The burden of proof has shifted. The Talpiot theory has to do more than just find a tomb with a few common names. It now has to compete with a site that has a real, tangible, first-century burial cave and a location that fits the historical record. The Holy Sepulchre, once a symbol of blind faith and historical confusion, is now a site of serious archaeological inquiry, and that more than anything is a change in the conversation that no one, not even the most sceptical archaeologist, could have predicted. You've walked the streets of ancient Jerusalem, visited the traditional and alternative tombs, and even delved into the science of DNA and dating. Now it's time to shift gears completely and look at a different artefact, one that has been at the centre of its own controversy for centuries. This is the Shroud of Turin, a large piece of linen cloth that bears the faint image of a man, and is believed by many to be the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. It's a mainstream historical fact that this artefact exists and has been venerated for centuries. But is it real? And what does it have to do with our search for Christ's tomb? The Shroud of Turin is a quirky or fringe tidbit in the context of the Talpiot tomb, but it's a mainstream historical fact on its own. It's a linen cloth, 14 feet long and 3 feet wide, that has been in Turin, Italy since 1578. It's marked with what appears to be the frontal and dorsal images of a man who suffered horrific injuries consistent with crucifixion. There are faint bloodstains, marks from a crown of thorns, and a piercing wound in the side. The image itself is a negative image, a detail that was only discovered in 1898, when an amateur photographer took the first picture of it and developed the plate. The resulting positive image revealed a face that was hauntingly realistic and beautiful, a face that became the iconic image of Jesus. The connection between the Shroud of Turin and the Talpiot tomb is a fascinating one, because it's a connection of absence. The Talpiot tomb theory, at its core, is a materialistic one. It's about finding a body, a set of bones, and a name on a box. It's a theory about the end of the line, the final resting place. The Shroud of Turin, however, is a theory about the beginning of the story, the moment of burial. If the shroud is real, and it wrapped the body of Jesus, then the body would have to have been removed from the shroud at some point. The shroud, in this case, would be a relic of the burial, not the tomb itself. It's an artifact that, if real, would imply the tomb is empty. This is in direct conflict with the Talpiot tomb theory, which requires the tomb to be full. So the two artifacts, the shroud and the Talpiot ossuaries, offer two completely different historical narratives. The scientific and historical debate over the Shroud of Turin is as fierce, if not more so, than the one over the Talpiot tomb. For a long time, the shroud was considered a forgery, but in 1978, a team of scientists, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP, was granted unprecedented access to the cloth. They performed a battery of tests, from photography to chemical analysis. Their conclusion was a mainstream historical fact. The image on the shroud was not a painting, a photograph, or a scorch mark. They couldn't explain how the image was formed, which led to a new wave of debate. But then, in 1988, came a bombshell. 3 separate laboratories, in Oxford, Zurich and Tucson, performed carbon-14 dating on a small piece of the shroud. Their results, a mainstream historical fact that sent shockwaves through the religious and scientific communities, all came back with the same conclusion. The shroud dated from 1260 to 1390 CE. In other words, it was a medieval forgery. This seemed to be the nail in the coffin for the shroud's authenticity. But, as with everything in this story, the debate is not over. Historians still argue whether the 1988 carbon-14 dating definitively proves the shroud is a medieval forgery. Proponents of the shroud's authenticity have pointed to a number of potential problems with the dating. They've argued that the sample used for the test was taken from a part of the shroud that was contaminated by medieval repairs, or by a fire that the shroud survived in the 16th century. Another quirky or fringe tidbit is a theory that the carbon-14 was contaminated by a massive influx of carbon monoxide in the year 1200, which would have skewed the results. This theory has been largely debunked by mainstream science, but it shows the lengths to which people will go to defend the shroud's authenticity. The search for Christ's tomb and the debate over the Shroud of Turin are two sides of the same coin. They are both quests for a tangible physical link to the historical Jesus. The shroud, if real, would be a relic of the resurrection, a witness to an empty tomb. The Talpiot tomb, if real, would be a relic of a normal death, a witness to a body that remained in its grave. They are mutually exclusive. You cannot have both. And the fact that both have been the subject of intense, often flawed scientific scrutiny and media sensationalism is a testament to the power of the central figure they both claim to be connected to. The Shroud of Turin is not a tomb, but it is a very powerful reminder that the search for the physical Jesus is a complicated, emotional, and often contradictory process. And in the end, it's a process that forces us to confront not just the facts, but our own beliefs about what we want those facts to be. You've heard the documentary's case, seen the DNA results, and even touched on the Shroud of Turin. But now you're going to sit down and listen to the other side, the voice of the skeptics. This is the part of the story that doesn't get a slick documentary with a movie star narrator. This is the quiet, reasoned voice of academic caution, a voice that argues the Talpiot tomb is nothing more than a statistical fluke, a random collection of names that just happens to look like something it isn't. The skeptic's case, a mainstream historical fact of the ensuing debate, is built on a few key pillars, all of which we've touched on in passing. But now we're going to put them all together, one by one, to build a complete and compelling counter-argument. The first and most important pillar is the prevalence of the names themselves. As we've established, names like Jesus, Joseph and Mary were the John, Mike and Jane of first century Judea. They were incredibly common. The documentary statistical argument, which claimed the combination was 1 in 600 million, was based on a flawed premise. Critics, including a number of professional statisticians, tore the model apart. They argued the sample size was too small, the assumptions were too generous, and the names were not as rare as the filmmakers claimed. A quirky, or fringe tidbit in this debate is a parallel study that was done to counter the documentary's claim. A group of scholars and statisticians created a new model, one that was based on a more realistic understanding of first-century names and family structures. They found that a tomb with the names Jesus, Joseph, Mary, and Judah would be found once every few centuries in Jerusalem. It's not a 1 in a million event, it's a perfectly probable one. The documentary's statistical argument was not a scientific fact, it was a rhetorical tool. It sounded impressive, but it didn't hold up to scrutiny. It was designed to convince, not to prove. The second pillar of the skeptic's case is the interpretation of the names themselves. The documentary's reading of the inscriptions was often the most sensational and least likely of a number of possibilities. For example, Yossi was presented as a brother of Jesus, but it's far more likely to be a nickname for Joseph. Mariamne Mara was presented as Mary Magdalene the Master, but it's just as likely, if not more so, to be 2 different names or a different translation entirely. Yehuda bar Yeshua was presented as a son of Jesus, but the name Jesus was so common that this could be a son of any number of men named Jesus. The skeptics argue that the documentary's entire case rests on a series of generous and often flawed interpretations. They argue that the filmmakers started with a conclusion and then cherry-picked the evidence to fit that conclusion. This is where a classic open scholarly debate phrase comes into play. Historians still argue whether the collection of names on the ossuaries is a random coincidence or a statistically improbable occurrence. The skeptics argue it's a random coincidence. They point to the fact that there are no other inscriptions or artifacts in the tomb that point to Jesus of Nazareth. There are no crosses, no fish symbols, nothing to indicate that the people buried there were early Christians. The tomb is a perfectly normal, first-century Jewish family tomb. The absence of evidence, in this case, is a powerful piece of evidence in itself. The third pillar of the skeptic's case is the total lack of historical and textual corroboration. The New Testament, the earliest Christian writers, and the early church fathers all tell a very different story. They tell a story of an empty tomb and a resurrected Christ. There is no mention in any of the early writings of a tomb full of bones, or of a wife and son. The Talpiot tomb theory requires us to believe that the entire history of Christianity is based on a lie or a misunderstanding, and that a small group of archaeologists and filmmakers have uncovered the real truth 2,000 years later. This is a very high bar to clear. The burden of proof, the skeptics argue, is on the proponents of the theory, and they have not met it. They have circumstantial evidence at best, and a mountain of historical and textual evidence to contend with. The skeptic's case is not as glamorous as the documentary. It's not as emotionally resonant. It doesn't offer the promise of a world-changing discovery. What it offers is a sober, reasoned analysis of the facts. It argues that the most likely explanation, the simplest explanation, is often the correct one. And in this case, the simplest explanation is that the Talpiot tomb is a tomb of a common family with common names, a family that just happens to be a statistical doppelganger for the most famous family in Western history. And sometimes, in the world of history, a coincidence is just a coincidence. You've heard the skeptic's argument, a cool and reasoned voice in the face of a media frenzy. But now, you're going to hear from the other side, from the proponents of the Talpiot tomb theory, who refuse to accept that it's all a coincidence. This is the argument that, for all its challenges, keeps the debate alive and humming. It's the case that says the skeptics are being too cautious, too conservative, and are missing the forest for the trees. The proponent's case is about probabilities, patterns, and a willingness to see beyond the conventional narrative. The proponents, a mainstream historical fact of the ongoing debate, don't deny that names like Jesus, Joseph, and Mary were common. They don't deny that an ossuary with Jesus, son of Joseph, on it is, on its own, a common archaeological find. Their argument is far more nuanced. They argue that the statistical unlikelihood is not about the individual names, but about the specific combination of those names in a single, sealed family tomb. They argue that this isn't a random collection of individuals, it's a family unit. And when you look at that family unit, the resemblance to the New Testament family is, in their view, too strong to be a coincidence. This is where a quirky or fringe tidbit comes into play, a new round of statistical analysis. While the documentary's initial statistical model was widely criticised, a few statisticians and scholars have tried to create more rigorous models. They've gone back to the drawing board, using more accurate data on the frequency of names and the size of Jerusalem's population. And even with these more conservative models, they still arrive at a number that, while not astronomical, is still very, very low. They argue that a family with all those names, Jesus, Joseph, two Marys, a Yos, brother, and a Judah, son, would be an incredibly rare find. It's a kind of statistical fingerprint, one that is unique to this tomb. It's the kind of thing that, if it were a modern crime scene, would be considered a major piece of evidence. The proponents also have a response to the argument about the ambiguous names. They argue that Yoseh is, in fact, a known nickname for James, the brother of Jesus, and that its presence in a tomb with Jesus and Mary is not a coincidence. They argue that Mariam and Amara is not a misreading or a simple conjunction, but a specific and intentional title that was used to refer to Mary Magdalene in early Christian texts, particularly in the Gnostic Gospels, a fact we touched on earlier. They argue that Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah son of Jesus, is not a random name, but a name that fits a historical narrative. They point to the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, which both provide a genealogy of Jesus, but do not mention a son. They argue that a son would have been a dangerous secret to keep in the early years of Christianity, a secret that would have been suppressed by the early church. This is where the debate moves from archaeology to theology, and it's a big leap. This brings us to a classic open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the Talpiot tomb is a statistical anomaly or an a priori assumption. The proponents would argue it's an anomaly. They say the names are a powerful clue, a signpost pointing to a specific historical truth. The skeptics would argue that the proponents are starting with the assumption that this is Jesus' tomb and then interpreting all the evidence from the names to the DNA to fit that assumption. They are looking for Jesus, and so they have found him. The proponents would counter that the initial discovery was so mundane precisely because no one was looking for him. It was a discovery that was ignored for 20 years, a fact that, they argue, makes it more, not less, authentic. The proponents also have a response to the lack of Christian symbols in the tomb. They argue that in the first century, Christianity was a nascent, secretive faith. There were no crosses or fish symbols. These came later. A first-century Christian would have looked and acted like a first-century Jew. The tomb is, in their view, exactly what a first-century Christian tomb would look like. They also point to a quirky or fringe tidbit of their own, a geometric symbol found on the ossuary of Judah son of Jesus that looks like a fish with a horizontal line through it. They argue this could be a rudimentary symbol for Jesus, a kind of proto-Christian fish symbol. It's a very tenuous connection, but it's a detail that, in their minds, adds another layer of intrigue to the tomb. So, the proponent's case is not just about a single fact. It's a constellation of facts, a pattern of evidence that, when viewed from a certain angle, points to a single, extraordinary conclusion. They argue that the probability of all these things, the specific combination of names, the possible connections to early Gnostic texts, the DNA results, the lack of Christian symbols, being a coincidence is so low that it's worth taking a serious look. They are willing to entertain the possibility of a world-changing discovery, and in doing so they keep the debate alive and force the skeptics to constantly re-evaluate their own assumptions. It's a classic battle between intellectual caution and intellectual courage, and it's a battle that, for now, has no clear winner. You've heard the back and forth, the arguments for and against. But now, let's leave the dusty tombs and sterile labs and step back into the spiritual world. The search for Christ's tomb isn't just an academic exercise, it's a deeply personal and, for many, a profoundly religious one. This section is about how the physical search for a body intersects with, and sometimes collides with, a faith that is built on the belief in a resurrection. For a believer, A mainstream historical fact is the narrative of the empty tomb. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John all tell a story of Jesus being buried in a tomb and then, on the third day, the tomb being found empty. This empty tomb is the cornerstone of Christian faith. It's the proof, for believers, of the resurrection. The entire structure of Christian theology, from the forgiveness of sins to the promise of eternal life, is built on this one historical claim, that Jesus was dead and then he was not. The empty tomb is the ultimate proof, so when the Talpiot tomb theory comes along and says we found the body, it's not just a challenge to a historical claim, it's a direct assault on the very foundation of faith. It's a challenge to the idea of the resurrection itself. If Jesus' bones are in a box in a suburban tomb in Jerusalem, then the tomb was not empty. The resurrection, as it's understood by billions of people, didn't happen. It's a choice between two completely different narratives, and for a believer, that choice is not a simple one. This is where a quirky or fringe tidbit comes in. A number of religious scholars and theologians have tried to find a way to reconcile the two narratives. They have proposed a number of theories, a kind of theological gymnastics, to try and make the Talpiot tomb fit into a Christian worldview. Some have suggested that the Talpiot tomb is a red herring, a distraction. Others have suggested that the resurrection was a spiritual, not a physical event, and that the body of Jesus was always meant to remain in the tomb. This is a very fringe theory, but it shows the lengths to which people will go to try and hold on to their faith in the face of new and challenging evidence. It's a testament to the power of belief and the human need to find a way to make the world and our stories make sense. This brings us to a classic open scholarly debate. The search for Christ's tomb forces a conversation about the nature of history and the nature of faith. Historians still argue whether an archaeological discovery could ever disprove the resurrection. The skeptics would argue that it could. If a body is found and it's proven to be Jesus, then the resurrection is a myth. The proponents of faith, however, would argue that faith is not dependent on a physical body. They would argue that the resurrection is a spiritual truth and that no amount of archaeological evidence could ever disprove it. They would argue that the historical evidence for the empty tomb, from the early writings of the apostles to the testimony of the early church, is strong enough to stand on its own. They would argue that the Talpiot tomb is a fascinating but ultimately irrelevant footnote to a much larger story. The debate is not just between archaeologists and theologians, it's a debate within ourselves. We're all, in a sense, a part of this. We all have to decide what we believe, what we are willing to accept as evidence, and what we are willing to accept on faith. The Talpiot tomb theory, for all its flaws, forces us to confront this question head-on. It forces us to ask, what if the story is different? What if the tomb was not empty? And what does that mean for our understanding of history and our understanding of ourselves? The search for a lost tomb is not just a quest for a set of bones. It's a quest for truth. And the truth in this case is a very difficult thing to find. It's a truth that is buried under layers of history, theology, and personal belief. It's a truth that for some is a matter of fact, and for others, a matter of faith. The Talpiot tomb debate is a microcosm of this larger struggle. It's a story about what happens when the physical world, with its cold and hard facts, collides with the spiritual world, with its warm and enduring beliefs. And in the end, it's a story that has no easy answers, and a debate that is likely to go on for as long as we continue to search for the truth. The search for a lost tomb, with its bones and inscriptions, leads us to a fascinating but often overlooked part of the story, the Roman Empire. You're standing now not in a quiet suburb or a chaotic church, but in the heart of first-century Jerusalem, a city under the iron fist of Roman occupation. This is a story of power, politics, and a historical what-if that could change everything. A mainstream historical fact is that the Romans were not just a military presence. They were an occupying force that ruled with an iron fist. They were known for their brutality, their efficiency, and their complete lack of tolerance for anything that threatened their authority. The crucifixion of Jesus, a common form of execution for rebels and traitors, was a public spectacle designed to send a clear message: oppose Rome, and this will be your fate. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, was known to be ruthless. He didn't care about Jewish religious law or prophecies, he cared about maintaining order. Now, here's the what if at the heart of this section. What if the Romans, in their efforts to maintain order, had a vested interest in the body of Jesus? A quirky or fringe tidbit is a theory that suggests the Romans knew that Jesus' followers were claiming he was the Messiah, the King of the Jews. They knew that these claims, if left unchecked, could lead to a full-blown rebellion. The last thing they needed was a charismatic leader's body becoming a focal point of worship and a symbol of rebellion. So what if they didn't just let the body be buried? What if they took it? This theory suggests a Roman conspiracy, not to hide the body and pretend it was resurrected, but to get rid of it and prevent the kind of fervour that a public tomb could generate. They would have seen it as a simple act of crowd control. The body of a crucified rebel would have been a nuisance. Its disappearance, whether through a secret burial or a public display of desecration, would have been a logical if cynical move. They had an army at their disposal, and they had complete control over the city. A small burial party of followers, even with the help of a wealthy man like Joseph of Arimathea, would have been no match for the Roman legion. Historians still argue whether the Romans had a political motive to move or hide the body of Jesus. The argument for this conspiracy is based on a few key points. First, the Gospels themselves contain a strange detail. A Roman guard was placed at the tomb to prevent the body from being stolen. This suggests that both the Romans and the Jewish authorities were worried about what would happen if the body disappeared. The Roman guard was there to prevent a hoax, not to protect a holy site. Second, the early Christian writings contain a number of alternative theories for the empty tomb, including the idea that the body was stolen by the Romans, or by the Jewish authorities, or even by a rival group of followers. The fact that these alternative theories existed at all suggests that the story of the empty tomb was not universally accepted in the first century. The counter-argument, of course, is that the Romans had a simple policy for crucified criminals. They were left on the cross to be eaten by scavengers. The fact that Jesus was buried at all is, according to some historians, the real surprise. The Roman authorities, busy with a large and unruly population, would have had little interest in one crucified Jew. His burial was probably a small and inconsequential detail to them. The idea of a Roman conspiracy to hide the body is, in this view, an anachronistic one, an attempt to project modern political intrigue onto a very different historical world. So where does the Talpiot tomb fit into this? The conspiracy theory provides a plausible explanation for why a body might be found in an unexpected place. If the Romans had moved the body, they might have put it in a common, unassuming tomb to make it harder to find. The Talpiot tomb, a modest suburban burial cave, would fit this profile perfectly. It would be the kind of place where a body could be hidden in plain sight, a place where no one would think to look. It's a very different narrative than the one of a small family burying a husband and father. It's a narrative of a political cover-up, a historical footnote that was meant to be forgotten. The Roman conspiracy theory adds another layer of complexity to our story. It's a story not just about archaeology, but about the politics of the time. It's a story about how power can shape history, and how a small, seemingly insignificant detail can have massive consequences. It's a story that forces us to look at the world of Jesus not just through a religious lens, but through a political one as well. And it's a story that, in the end, offers a plausible, if unproven, explanation for the most enduring mystery of all. You've explored the theories, the facts, and the conspiracies. But now it's time for the most profound and difficult part of our journey. What if they really did find the tomb of Christ? What would that mean, not just for archaeologists, but for everyone else? This isn't a question of evidence, it's a question of consequence. This section is about the theological and spiritual fallout of a world-changing discovery. The foundational principle of Christianity, a mainstream historical fact of the religion itself, is the resurrection. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, put it bluntly: "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins." In other words, if Jesus' body remained in a tomb, the entire Christian religion as we know it collapses. It's a house of cards built on a single, powerful claim. The discovery of Christ's bones in a suburban tomb would be the ultimate proof that the tomb was not empty. It would prove that the resurrection was a myth, a misunderstanding, or a pious lie. The implications are staggering. For billions of people around the world, this would be a crisis of faith on an unimaginable scale. It would challenge the very nature of their relationship with God, their understanding of sin and salvation, and their hope for an afterlife. It would force them to confront the possibility that the central figure of their faith was not a divine being who conquered death, but a man who lived and died just like everyone else. The hope that death is not the end, a hope that is at the heart of the Christian message, would be replaced by the cold, hard reality of a box of bones. It's a very heavy thought, and it's the reason why so many people, from theologians to ordinary believers, are so invested in this debate. Now here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. A number of theologians and scholars have argued that the resurrection was always meant to be understood as a spiritual event, not a physical one. This is a very old theological debate, but the Talpiot tomb theory gives it a new urgency. This theory suggests that the resurrection was a victory over sin and death in a spiritual sense, and that the empty tomb was a symbol, not a literal fact. In this view, a body in a tomb doesn't disprove the resurrection, it simply redefines it. It forces us to look at the Gospels not as historical reportage but as theological allegory. This is a very difficult position to hold, and it's not a view shared by mainstream Christianity, but it shows the creative ways in which people try to reconcile science and faith. This brings us to a classic open scholarly debate. How would a discovery of a body in the Talpiot tomb impact the theological foundations of Christianity? The answer is far from simple. On one hand, many would argue it would be a death blow. The very idea of the resurrection as a physical event is so central to the faith that its disproof would be catastrophic. It would render the New Testament in many ways a work of historical fiction. It would mean that the promises of Christ, from eternal life to the forgiveness of sins, were based on a falsehood. It would be a moment of intellectual and spiritual reckoning. On the other hand, some would argue that faith is more resilient than that. They would argue that a discovery of a body, even if proven to be Christ's, would not destroy the faith, but change it. They would argue that the moral teachings of Jesus, his message of love and forgiveness, and his example of self-sacrifice, are powerful enough to stand on their own, even without the resurrection. They would argue that the central figure of Christianity is a figure of profound moral and spiritual weight, and that his life, not his resurrection, is the core of the faith. In this view, the discovery would not be an end, but a beginning, a chance for Christianity to redefine itself in a world without a physical resurrection. The impact of a discovery would also have a profound effect on the other Abrahamic faiths. For Jews, a discovery of a body would be a vindication. They have long argued that Jesus was a man, a Jewish teacher, and not the Son of God. The Talpiot tomb would prove them right. For Muslims, it would also be a vindication. They believe that Jesus was a prophet of God, but not divine, and that he did not die on the cross. The Talpiot tomb would not prove their entire narrative, but it would certainly support the idea that he died a mortal death. The discovery, in this view, would not just be a Christian problem, it would be a seismic event for all of Western religion. So the search for a lost tomb is not just a question of history or archaeology. It's a question of theology, of spirituality, and of the very nature of belief itself. It forces us to ask what we hold to be true and what we are willing to let go of. It forces us to confront the possibility that the stories we tell ourselves, the stories that shape our lives and our cultures, are not always what they seem. And in that confrontation, we are forced to re-examine not just the past, but our own place in the present. So you've travelled all this way with me, through ancient streets and modern labs, through passionate documentaries and sober academic papers. We've looked at bones, we've looked at names, and we've looked at the very nature of belief itself. Now it's time to bring our journey to a close and ask the final and most important question. Where do we stand today? Have archaeologists finally found the lost tomb of Christ? The simple and perhaps frustrating answer is no. A mainstream historical fact is that the Talpiot tomb, for all its controversy and sensationalism, has not been accepted by the mainstream archaeological community as the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth. The consensus for now remains a resounding not proven. The evidence, while intriguing, is simply not strong enough to overturn 2 millennia of history and tradition. The names, as we've seen, are a powerful red herring. The DNA evidence is inconclusive. The statistical arguments are flawed, and the physical evidence from the tomb itself to the inscriptions is, at best, circumstantial. This is where a classic open scholarly debate phrase comes into play. Historians still argue whether the Talpiot tomb is a legitimate if unproven theory, or a sensationalized misinterpretation of archaeological data. The proponents of the theory a small but vocal group continue to publish papers and hold conferences, trying to build a more compelling case. They argue that the evidence, when taken together, points to an inescapable conclusion. They believe that the truth is there, buried in a suburban tomb, and that the academic world is simply too conservative or too afraid to accept it. The skeptics, however, remain steadfast. They argue that the tomb is just a tomb, and that the combination of names is a coincidence, an interesting but ultimately meaningless historical footnote. They see the entire affair as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of sensationalism and the pitfalls of starting with a conclusion and then looking for evidence to support it. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit that has emerged in the years since the documentary's release. The possibility that the Talpiot tomb is not just one tomb, but part of a larger cemetery. Subsequent excavations in the area have uncovered other burial caves, some with similar ossuaries. This suggests that the Talpiot tomb, with its now famous names, was not a unique, isolated phenomenon. It was just one of many similar tombs in a larger burial ground. This further weakens the statistical argument. If a tomb with those names is not a one-in-a-kind discovery, but just one of many in a cluster of tombs, then the probability of it being a random coincidence increases dramatically. It's a very quiet, very boring piece of evidence, but it's a powerful one. It's a reminder that archaeology is a slow, painstaking process, and that a single discovery, no matter how dramatic, must be viewed in the context of a larger picture. So, where does this leave you? You're left with a mystery. You're left with a set of facts that can be interpreted in a dozen different ways. The search for the lost tomb of Christ has not ended with a definitive answer. It has ended with a question. It has ended with a conversation. The Talpiot tomb theory, for all its flaws, has done one thing right. It has forced us to re-examine the historical record, to ask new questions, and to look at old stories with new eyes. It has reminded us that history is not a static collection of facts, but a dynamic and ever-changing narrative. It has reminded us that the past is a messy, complicated, and often ambiguous place. The debate, of course, continues. There are new technologies, new theories, and new discoveries yet to be made. The Talpiot tomb may one day be proven to be nothing more than a statistical fluke, or a new piece of evidence may emerge that changes everything. But for now, the tomb remains what it has always been, a fascinating unresolved question. It is a question that challenges us to think about the nature of evidence, the power of belief, and the enduring mystery of history's most famous figure. Now, as the long journey ends, let's dim the lights a little more. Let the day's worries and the week's anxieties fade into the background. Let the details of our story, the dusty tombs, the ancient names, the whispered theories, soften around the edges. The truth about the past is often elusive, a faint echo in a long empty room. We search for it not because we expect a simple answer, but because the act of searching, of questioning, of wondering is a part of who we are. It's in these moments of quiet contemplation that we find not just history, but a piece of ourselves. The mystery of the tomb for now remains unsolved, a silent question waiting in the darkness. But the story, the search, and the journey itself, they have left their mark. You can now rest, knowing you've seen the depths of this ancient puzzle.